G'day everybody, my name is Elliot Waters and you're listening to the Dysregulated podcast. As always, thank you for tuning in. Now today's episode has been a long time coming. It is part 2 of the left versus right brain series. Yes, part 2, it's finally here. Today we are looking at left dominant therapeutic approaches. So in particular, cognitive behavioural therapy and dialectical behaviour therapy. And needless to say, part 3 will be looking at the right dominant therapeutic approaches. And in that episode, we're going to focus on schema therapy and psychoanalysis. But today, it is all about the left side. So before we get into the new material, let's do a little recap on the last episode, part 1, theories and behaviours. Okay, so the left brain or hemisphere is associated with logical, rational thinking. It has been shown that the left hemisphere provides us with our black and white cognitive processes and the use of factual, procedural, conscious knowledge. The left hemisphere is also implicated in speaking, reading and writing. Literacy and numeracy ability is theorized to be housed in this hemisphere, as well as time awareness and something that I struggle with a lot, which is thinking in a linear step-by-step fashion. On the other hand, or the other side of the brain, the right hemisphere controls the use of abstract meaning and thinking, is heavily linked to understanding visual perceptions, recognizing faces, the use of imagination and intuition. The right side is the musical and artistic hemisphere. And finally, most importantly for me, the right side of the brain is the emotional center. And as we saw in part 1 of the series, if you remember way back when, if the right brain is overly dominant, then an individual such as myself is often ruled by emotion, with logical reasoning taking a back seat. Now, ain't that the truth? So although there is debate on how lateralized our different thought processes and behaviors actually are, the literature mostly agrees that at the very least, certain brain regions that control certain cognitions and behaviours seem to be clumped together, either on one side of the brain or the other. So how do we know that this general hypothesis has merit? I'm so glad you asked. Well, we can look at the work of neuropsychologists for the answers. They study brain injuries and the resulting changes in behaviour. So this is what they've found. So injuries on the left side of the brain tend to result in these following things: difficulty understanding and expressing spoken and written language, alterations in speech, verbal memory issues. So to define verbal memory, it's a term used mostly in cognitive psychology that refers to the memory of words and other abstractions involving language. So as expected by the name, this memory is then expressed through verbal means. What else have we got? Problems with movement on the right side. Remember, the stimulus, the input of one side of the body or the other, is projected to the opposite side of the brain. So right side stuff in the real world goes into our brain and hits the left side of the brain and vice versa. Okay, so we've got problems with movement on the right side. We also have deficits in the ability to plan, organise and other executive functions. Also of significance is that in many cases, these individuals show an impaired ability to use logic and reasoning, which makes perfect sense given the left versus right brain hypothesis that we're looking at. So now jumping over onto the right side injuries can result in these things: impairments in attention. So that's interesting in light of ADHD, very interesting. Overall memory problems. There is a decreased awareness of these deficits. So the individual isn't necessarily conscious of these impairments, which is a bit of a scary thought. What else is there? There is a loss in abstract thinking and the ability to abstractly create the big picture of things. There is also a loss in creativity and the perception of the arts. Okay, so now that the recap is done, let's have a look at the current state of play as far as therapy approaches go and the therapeutic options available to us and how they work and operate within the left versus right brain paradigm, looking at the left side today. So according to Alan Shaw in his book, The Science of the Arts of Psychotherapy, the mental health realm is dominated by left brain processes and thinking. And that extends all the way to the clinic in which therapy is formulated and how it is administered. In particular, he postulates that the reliance on psychopharmacology over therapy, so that's medications instead of therapy, the checklist nature of psychotherapy, and the reductionist nature of adhering to the evidence-based structure is taking the flair and personability of therapy away from the client with negative results. So instead of creating a therapeutic framework formulated from first-person insights and assessments of the individual, their unique difficulties, experiences, their stories and goals for therapy, which are all very individual, some mental health providers will take, I suppose you could say, an almost one-size-fits-all approach, which usually comes in the form of cognitive behavioural therapy, which we will look at in more depth shortly. Okay, so in basic terms, no matter the client and their own individual makeup, doctors and therapists are using the same practices as they would with anybody else. It is taking away, as Alan Shaw says, the art of psychotherapy, where the psychologist is able to use a variety of therapeutic approaches and tailor treatment to the individual's unique set of circumstances. So, essentially, I guess I am calling out the therapists here who rely heavily on cognitive behavioural therapy. It is not the be-all and end-all. So, there are plenty of other therapies that have also proven over a long period of time how efficacious they can be. So, I am putting a bit of a call out there. If you are a therapist that just relies on CBT, please stop doing that. Okay, but before I rubbish CBT completely, it must be said that it is considered, and for good reason, the gold standard of psychotherapeutic intervention across many different mental health expressions and manifestations. But, as one psychologist once told me, CBT is almost beginner level stuff. Although it is backed by a huge amount of research, and it is, many people do find CBT extremely helpful, but there is also a large group of people where CBT just doesn't cut through. And of course, you may have guessed it from listening to this podcast, I am one of these people. But before I go into CBT with a bit more depth, the reason CBT is used so often is because of this reductionism of therapy approaches. So that is where a therapist is compelled to follow evidence-based practice principles, even if in this current therapeutic relationship, there is evidence that maybe something else should be tried. So, of course, CBT has the most research, so it should be used often in clinical settings, definitely. But problems occur when the therapist is cornered by the evidence-based approach, even though the real-world cues, like I said, that they are receiving from their clients are saying a different approach should be tried. Sometimes one has to go beyond the principles laid out in textbooks and manuals and be guided by the here and now. Some of us, again, this is me, don't quite fit the textbook examples. No, I don't. I'm so unique. Isn't it wonderful? So, moving along, Thomas Field, in his paper, Integrating Left Brain and Right Brain, the Neuroscience of Effective Counselling, explains how cognitive behavioural therapy and evidence-based treatment essentially has come to mean the same thing. That many therapists are experts in CBT, and that is it. Of equal consequence, many psychologists are taught mostly about therapeutic approaches in a standardized way, while not focusing on improving relational skills, interpersonal skills, and more broadly, how to build the therapeutic relationship, which is oh so important. So Carl Rogers, a famous psychotherapist and pioneer of the humanist approach to psychology, stressed the importance of the individual to direct the course of therapy. He believed, quite rightly, that we all have a strong desire to fulfill our potential and be the best that we can be. Therefore, his approach to therapy, called client-centered therapy, which is very famous and for good reason because it works, encourages the individual to use their own strengths and abilities to facilitate change. It is the individual who does the changing. It's not the therapist who forces change. So the client and the therapist are equals within the therapeutic relationship, and it is the client who directs the course of therapy. For example, I've identified in the past this is me talking, Elliot has identified in the past specific therapeutic approaches I felt would work best for me. And the psychologists that I've had the best results with, including my current therapist, are guided by my input. Circling back to the shortcomings of the checklist textbook approach, in my opinion, that way of doing therapy reduces the autonomy of the client. It can be disempowering at its worst and definitely is not responsive to the unique set of circumstances the client brings with them. Bad news, especially for those with complex cases like myself, who can present with a very different set of behaviours, thoughts and cognitions from session to session, depending on which disorder has decided to take the lead. And they fight really hard to get to that pole position too, let me tell you. So to sum up this section quickly, if a psychologist is guided by this checklist approach, as opposed to the needs and wants of the client, often little progress will be made. And unfortunately, CBT, as good as it is for many people, is structured in a way that promotes the use of an evidence-based, predetermined set of steps, which diminishes the role of the client in improving their own well-being. So, with all that said, let's look at our first therapy, and you guessed it, it is cognitive behavioural therapy. Now, this episode won't be an exhaustive list of the different therapies out there, nor will it go into great detail on each approach. Well, a little bit of detail. But fear not, I will be doing separate episodes in the future, looking at these main therapies individually. Okay, so CBT. As I said earlier, it has the most research around it, and by quite a long way. It was originally developed by Aaron Beck, and CBT has proven efficacy for many mental health disorders, including the mood disorders like major depressive disorder, the different anxiety disorders, substance abuse problems, eating disorders, and specific thoughts and behaviors such as low self-esteem, irrational fears, gambling addictions, and even sleep problems. And I'll tell you what, this is not an exhaustive list of CBT's uses. So really, although I sort of rubbished it before, it is really good stuff if the individual responds. That's the whole point. So CBT most broadly is founded on the idea that our thoughts, feelings, how we behave, and how our body feels are all intertwined. If one of the links in this chain is altered, then this can have a flow-on effect and improve the other facets as well. So, according to the American Psychological Association, CBT is based on a few key principles, and they are: number one, psychological problems are based in part on faulty or unhelpful ways of thinking. Makes sense. Number two, psychological problems are based in part on learned patterns of unhelpful behaviours. For example, maladaptive behaviours in response to situations or triggers. And number three, that people are able to learn better ways of coping with psychological distress, which in turn relieves symptoms and enables the individual to become more effective in their lives. Okay, so most of that I think is pretty self-explanatory. Okay, so again, with the help from the APA, CBT in practice looks something like this. First off, we have cognitive restructuring. So this is all about learning to recognize one's distorted thinking patterns that are creating problems and evaluating these objectively and in reality. So you may ask yourself, does this thought I'm having actually have any logical basis? Further, we try to gain a better understanding of our behaviors. What is driving them? For example, is it my beliefs or misunderstanding of the situation? Are they good coping strategies or are they maladaptive? And what seems to trigger these behaviours? Speaking of beliefs and understandings, a huge part of CBT is challenging our rigid beliefs and understandings of how the world works around us. We all interpret our environments, such as our interactions with others, in our own way, and through these experiences we formulate our view of how things are. So someone who has built up a bit of a pessimistic view of things, for whatever reason, will have beliefs and understandings that are overly negative. In my experience, the longer these beliefs and understandings have been held, the more they seem to drift towards extreme and unhelpful illogical conclusions. So my longest held negative beliefs seem to be the most irrational and also the most difficult to change. And you can imagine how that can influence behaviour. So in CBT, we learn new problem-solving skills to cope with difficult situations as they arise, to avoid the automatic response of engaging with our patterned maladaptive behaviours. And we seek to develop the idea and instill the belief that we can be confident in our ability to regulate our lives, and in doing so, doing it in a measured and healthy manner. So the majority of that part of CBT is very much thought-based. That's the cognitive component. But it isn't all about our cognitions. An effort to change behavioural patterns is also sought. So in therapy, it looks a bit like this. So to begin with, facing one's fears instead of avoiding them. Yes, that's right. Facing these fears head on. So on a side note, a lot of research supports the power of voluntarily facing one's fears instead of waiting for the fear-invoking situation to come to them. This voluntary movement towards the places we do not want to go, which is a bit of a Jungian idea, I will expand on that more in future episodes, has shown time and time again to empower people and strengthen the idea and feeling of control one has over their lives. So instead of being ruled by fear and waiting for it to come to you, you nullify it first. Exposure therapy, which you may have heard of, works on this idea with those suffering from phobias or anxiety disorders. And CBT certainly can help on this front as well. So it's all about facing one's fears instead of avoiding them. All right. Number 2, using role play to prepare for potentially problematic interactions with others. Classic example of this is mimicking a conversation, and I've done this myself in therapy, between the client, me, and their boss, whoever that may be, over an issue at work, such as the request for a pay rise. The process is broken down step by step until the individual feels confident that they have the ability to manage such a conversational situation. So you really play it out first. Practice makes perfect. So when you do go into that interaction with your boss, you can be confident knowing that you know what to do because we've done this all before. Okay, and the third key of CBT when it comes to behavior is learning to calm one's mind and relax one's body. So that's all about mindfulness and that sort of stuff. Okay, so another fundamental premise of CBT is that feelings and behaviors are influenced by the way situations are interpreted. That is, individuals respond to the cognitive representations of events instead of the actual events themselves. So I guess in a way, you sort of make up your own theory and that's the reality when really it isn't. We need to check what really happened. So the theory holds that individuals process information in ways which don't match the reality, like I just said, of the situation. So what I'm thinking, I've created that all in my head. It's not even real, Let's get out of our heads for a while and have a look at what's really going on. That's the sort of underlying idea with that. So this disconnect between what we're thinking and what is actually happening creates, as you could imagine, cognitive distortions. Okay, so in my assessment, CBT is very much about targeting the left side of the brain by altering these distorted thinking patterns, which distinctly lack a logical base to them. There's that word again, logic, and strengthening new or underrepresented thoughts that are logical, adaptive, and based in reality. So, as I see it, CBT is all about building up and beefing up the left hemisphere's output. We want to give the left side a strong voice in the face of an overstimulated and obnoxious right side. There is little evidence as far as my understanding of the literature is concerned, along with my experiences in therapy, to suggest that CBT influences the right side to any degree. CBT is anchored to the needs of the left brain. And it appears from the research, those who are able to connect to their left brain better will see better results. CBT focuses on maladaptive cognitive functions and attempts to restructure these thoughts by utilizing logical thinking. So, I've just thought something illogical and I'm feeling it and that must be my reality. Hang on, stop. Let's use logic and actually evaluate what we're thinking here. Is there any facts to this? And often there isn't. Okay, So CBT very much targets erroneous thinking and thoughts arising from the left hemisphere as opposed to stopping the right hemisphere from smothering it. That's important, very important. I'll say that again. So it's all about fixing maladaptive thought processes in the left hemisphere, but it's not about putting the brakes on the right hemisphere. So if you're like me and all that emotion just keeps flooding in, CBT may not help that much. Okay, so CBT is a therapy created by left brain thinkers for left brain thinkers. Yes, Ackerman and Hilsenroth in 2001 put it nicely when they theorised that a purely left brain approach to therapy can find itself becoming overly rigid and obsessed with adhering to the accepted standard procedure, those bloody standards again. And this rigidity creates barriers between the therapist and the client. Yes, it does. The therapist's role, as we will see shortly, is more than just as instructor and note taker. And we'll definitely see that in part 3 of this series. Okay, so let's dive a little bit deeper with CBT and see how it actually works. Why is it so good, in many cases, at doing what it does, making people feel better? So CBT treatment relies heavily on verbal cues, which makes sense. Remember, left hemisphere, very much about the understanding, the expression of verbal memory. And CBT uses this to develop the ability to self-monitor one's thoughts, feelings, and behaviours, and develop the skill of re-evaluating our thoughts and emotions. CBT's reliance on verbal processes can be a challenge for those who aren't as comfortable with analysing information and solving problems using language-based reasoning. What this means is that the treatment success with CBT may rely and be mediated by the client's verbal intelligence and the ability to activate and utilise the various left brain processes. So, again, it's good for some people, but for others, we need to look at different approaches. So Kishon, I hope I pronounced that correctly, and colleagues in 2015 found that, as expected, those with left hemisphere advantage responded strongly to CBT compared to those with right brain dominance, like me, and had a greater improvement in depressive symptoms among their sample. So their conclusions were that psychometric tests such as the dichotic fused words test, you can look that up if you want, you definitely don't have to, which measures left brain activation through the use of audio samples presented to subjects, can predict whether an individual will benefit from CBT. That's pretty groundbreaking. This finding was also found by Bruder and colleagues in their paper published in 2017. So again, if like me, you struggle to tap into the left hemisphere's processes because perhaps the right hemisphere is so dominant, then cognitive behavioural therapy may not be the best option for you, and it certainly wasn't the best option for me. So to sum up cognitive behavioural therapy, the bottom line is it does work. It does. But it works better for some people more than others. Now, most people who have been to therapy will have definitely been exposed to CBT, whether explicitly or not. And although it's viewed as the gold standard, CBT is reportedly only effective in between 40 to 60% of individuals with major depressive disorder. This is interesting because this is essentially the same efficacy rate as antidepressant medication. So there you go, 40 to 60% success rate for both. The evidence-based approach, which I've referred to quite a bit so far in this episode, although points to CBT as being the most researched and successful therapy, also says to consider other therapies, as CBT isn't the be-all and end-all like some think. Some mental health professionals tend to gloss over this fact. So that begs the question, what other alternative therapeutic interventions are there? And there is plenty. So the next one we're going to see moves the needle from well and truly in the left dominant side of things towards the middle. And this therapy is called dialectical behaviour therapy. So DBT. All right, so as the name suggests, it builds upon the theory set out by CBT. So what sets DBT apart from CBT is the overt acknowledgement of the role both hemispheres play in producing our behaviours. So in DBT, there is a concept called the wise mind. And do I know all about the wise mind? The wise mind is seen as the anchored to the present mind. It's mindful. It is the calm center point of the emotional mind, which is the right brain, and the thinking side, the left. The therapy asks us to integrate information from both the left and right side by being present consciously in the moment, also known as mindfulness, being mindful, and evaluating each stream of information from either side as objectively as possible. And from this evaluation, proceeding with a wise mind that has come to a well thought out and sensible decision by drawing upon all available information, not just the inputs of the overactive emotional side of the brain. So whereas CBT is the gold standard treatment for mental health in general, DBT is the undisputed champion gold standard treatment for borderline personality disorder. So BPD, which is viewed typically as a disorder of an overactive emotional mind, which drowns out the logical thinking side. And again, do I know that? DBT tries to build up the left logical side whilst keeping a lid on the right emotional side. DBT is different from many therapies. It is usually conducted in group settings, so it's group therapy, and it goes for at least 6 months. So me personally, I have done DBT in an outpatient group setting for 6 months, and it was really good. It worked very well for me. So much of the therapy is concerned with the evaluation of our perceptions to see if it stacks up against logic and the actual reality of the situation we find ourselves in, very similar to CBT. So we are taught to break free of the twisted and distorted perception that BPD is trying to pass off as reality. Still a work in progress. You are taught different skills such as checking the facts, which helps us evaluate any given situation as objectively as needed, ensuring one responds in an appropriate way. So a core component of DBT is the practicing of mindfulness, very much so. Mindfulness is huge in DBT, and the whole point is to help us gain distance from automatic, emotionally driven thoughts and behaviours so we can think and act in a measured way. And a very significant and important skill I learnt through DBT, me personally, is something called radical acceptance. In fact, I've got a whiteboard behind me as I'm speaking right now, and in big capital letters in a black whiteboard marker, I have written radical acceptance every day because I try to use it every day. Although I'll tell you what, it is still a bit of a struggle. So radical acceptance is all about accepting what is instead of fighting what cannot be changed, but committing to changing and improving those things we do have control over. So for example, I had to accept that I have a high degree of mental complexity, and that's just the way it is. And there's no use trying to pretend it isn't the case. But I do have the ability to engage with therapy and trial different medications to improve my quality of life. And that is true, definitely. And that is what I am doing. So instead of dwelling and ruminating on how I have mental health problems while others may not, those lucky few, which can only fuel jealousy, I focus my energies on what I can control and change, such as starting this podcast. So DBT is as much about, like I said, reining in the right brain as it is about building up the left. It borrows a lot from CBT to straighten out these illogical cognitions and beliefs on the left side and utilizes mindfulness practices to calm the right side down. Personally, I found it very helpful in straightening out some of my logical beliefs I have about myself and my current predicament, although there is still plenty of work to be done on this front, that is for sure. But my biggest problem has always been the overexuberance of my right hemisphere and the automatic emotionally charged responses I'll have to different situations. I will fly off the handle and then later on think, you know what, it wasn't really that bad. Anyway, so in fact, my two hemispheres have tended to work together to bring me down, really. And it does it like this. The left side will meekly put forward some illogical belief that it knows will trigger a strong emotional right side response. Jeez. And once the right side gets in on the action, it can take a long time and a lot of effort to seek and find clarity. In the past, this clarity would rarely eventuate because I didn't have the level of insight into my own workings as I do now. And it's so important that if you are also going through a mental health concern, that you get to know yourself. But thanks to DBT, I've been able to get both hemispheres at least in the same book, if not the same page. The lingering problem, though, that I have is my right side or emotional brain still reverts to maladaptive automatic thinking and assumptions. Although my left side is stronger than it was, it still isn't robust enough in the face of right side emotional flooding to overcome these negative feelings and thoughts in the moment, not after. We want to be able to assess them in the moment before we act. So that goes again back to the wise mind. We want to proceed with a wise mind, and we do that by being mindful. So I am, though, able to tap into my wise mind now, where previously I haven't been able to. But frustratingly, I'm only able to do so after the initial reaction to an event or trigger. So what I do, I know something's triggered. What I try and do is freeze. Just stop. Just don't do anything, Elliot. Don't say anything. Don't act until that huge emotional reaction subsides. Then we can proceed mindfully. So the next step for me really is to engage in therapies which are heavily skewed towards the right hemisphere now, with the aim to contain and lessen my right brain's influence. So we've gotten to the point where I can stop, use some of my DBT skills to calm down, then we proceed. But sometimes that can take a bit of time, and sometimes there isn't the time to do that. So the key is now to dial down the right hemisphere. We've built up the left. It's there now, but it's still being flooded. So let's stop the emotional flooding. So honing in a little bit more on how DBT actually works. So what DBT aims to do is help people build 4 major skills. So all the skills I'm talking about are subcomponents of these big 4. So the first one is mindfulness. So throughout the whole 6 months, the therapy very much focuses on mindfulness, how to proceed mindfully, how to distance one from emotional thoughts, and to be anchored and present in the moment, right here, right now. Now, what else DBT focuses on are these 3 other major skills. One is distress tolerance. The second is interpersonal effectiveness. And the third, emotional regulation. So what usually happens is you start DBT and there's obviously the mindfulness component, which covers the whole 6 months, but then you will focus on distress tolerance, interpersonal effectiveness, and emotional regulation for 2 months at a time. So for 2 months, you learn all the sub-skills that help build distress tolerance or help build interpersonal effectiveness or help build the ability to emotionally regulate oneself. For me, I must say, one of the best parts of DBT was the group therapy sessions where you learn these skills, not only because of the skills that I was learning, but also because you can hear other people's stories. You're with people that know what it's like to live the way that you are living. Although we all have very unique, different stories, the commonalities that we all had together really made it worthwhile, because for the first time, I understood that what I was experiencing really wasn't just something that was unique to me. And that in itself was a huge, huge benefit of DBT. So further, DBT uses 3 main types of therapy approaches. So as we know, there's the skills training. So that's once a week for 6 months. And quite often people do repeat it and will do 12 months worth of skills training. I did just 6, but to be honest, looking back, I probably could have done a repeat again. But anyway, that's the way it goes. So as well as the group therapy once a week for 6 months, you also should have one-on-one therapy with your own psychologist as well. So in these particular sessions, you tend to talk to your therapist about what you're working on in the group skills sessions, how it's working for you, how it's not working for you, and ways to manage it as well. And the third component is phone coaching. So this isn't offered by all DBT providers. It wasn't when I did it, but I wish it was. So the phone coaching is extra support between the one-on-one sessions and the group sessions as well. So if things are getting a bit tough and you're trying to use a skill but it just isn't working for you, the idea is you can ring this number, you talk to a coach who will then talk you through the process of using whatever skills you need to use to make sure you act mindfully and proceed with a wise mind in the face of something triggering. So as I said though, the key for me, and I think a lot of other people that do DBT though, is to really get to the heart of what is driving these maladaptive thoughts, emotions and behaviours. So DBT is very good at getting an individual in a position where they can manage day to day, moment to moment, their different emotional flooding situations. But the problem is, the only real problem with DBT, because I'm telling you, it's brilliant, is I don't think it quite goes to the heart, to the core content of the individual, the experiences and memories that are driving these emotionally charged events and reactions. So I think if I was a therapist, which I hopefully will be one day soon, if I had someone like me that had borderline personality disorder, my first step would be to get them in a group therapy DBT class, definitely. But once that was done and they're equipped with all the different skills and techniques to regulate their emotions and proceed in a way that is mindful, I then would look at some different therapies to really get to the heart of what's going on here. So DBT is so good at equipping people with some skills and techniques to manage those day-to-day situations. But I do really think for an individual to get long-term peace of mind, you've got to go to the places you do not want to go to find out what happened, what wisdom can we take from that situation, what is the lesson to be learned, and then we can let go of that pain and that emotional trauma, whatever it is. And that's where I think the right brain focused therapies can do a great job. But I also think if you're someone with borderline personality disorder or maybe another personality disorder or even complex PTSD or PTSD, I really think DBT is the first port of call because you really need those skills. So when these memories pop up or triggering events, that you know how to proceed mindfully so we don't create more trauma for ourselves. And then once those skills are embedded into the individual, that's when I think we look at these right brain focused therapies and really get to the crux of the matter. But anyway, we as a group listening to this podcast, we will look at those therapies in a lot of depth in the next episode on part 3 of the Left versus Right Brain series. I'm very excited to present that as well. So hopefully, this episode has gone a little bit of a way to explain some of the ways that we can focus in on the left brain way of thinking. If it's not thinking properly, it's coming up with some maladaptive cognitive processes, which are then driving some maladaptive behaviours, which are making life very difficult. The good news is there are specific therapies that we can use to target that way of thinking and the behaviours produced. And that is great news. But it is important that therapists and clients are aware that there is more out there than just cognitive behavioural therapy, which does do a very good job, and the research would suggest so as well. But some people, like myself, are very complex, and we need to look at the broad picture, and we need to work on the right side of the brain as well. Now, DBT goes some of the way there. What it does very well is try to balance the need to build up some healthy thinking from the left side and give it a voice. But we also need to come up with a way to control the right side's input, because at the moment, for people like me, it's just too much. But as we'll see on the next episode, part 3 of this series, there are also therapies that focus wholly on the right side. And I'll tell you what, they are very, very different from the 2 therapies I've outlined today, very much so. And they need to be. They need to be, or else they will not encapsulate what the right brain is all about. So thank you very much for listening. I hope that's gone a bit of a way to explaining the different approaches there are to therapy, what the state of play is as we speak now, and ways I think the therapist maybe could improve the way they do things. And I'm really looking forward to part 3 of this series where we tie it all together and we help the right brain pick its moments. Listen here, right brain, we don't want to hear from you constantly. I appreciate the efforts you're putting in, but we need to dial it down a little bit. And let's just make sure that this emotional response that you're giving me right now is actually in line with what's going on in the real world. And I'm here to help you do that through such therapies like schema therapy and psychoanalysis. But that is all in part 3 that is coming up very soon. I'm very much looking forward to that. It should hopefully be a beauty. So anyway, thank you for listening. I hope that makes sense. There was a lot of research has gone into these 3 episodes, and at times you can go down the rabbit hole and be a bit disorientated, not quite sure what we're actually reading and if it makes sense. So hopefully I've been able to present it in a way that is easily digestible. If you've got any questions, feel free to send them to me on Instagram at elliot.t.waters. And until next time, stay mentally well, and I look forward to joining you for part 3 when we look at the right side of things and the therapies that we can use to really calm down that right side of the brain. So thank you very much. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time here on the Dysregulated podcast.